so much for having us. I'm so happy to be here and to get to share your beautiful home with our audience.
Yeah, I'm happy that I can give you a tour and show you around.
Yes, I love seeing your space because, we haven't done a small space in our series yet. And so I love the opportunity to pick your brain about small spaces and to show everyone your gorgeous townhouse. Tell everybody kind of, before we get started, what it was like when you bought it and sort of what your vision was,
Sure.
For the space.
Well, I'm honored to be the first. So thank you. I purchased this townhome about 4 years ago. So this was my first home that I've owned and not apartment living. So when I purchased it, it was just a blank slate, a lot of builder grade finishes. Mm-hmm. It was renovated to sell. So there wasn't just a whole lot of care taken in picking those finishes because they knew they weren't going to be here. Yeah. So my main priority was really bringing charm back into the space and kind of making it my own.
I feel like there are a few themes that are emerging, but I'm curious, what were your first things to accomplish on your to-do list?
Sure. The very first thing was changing out all of the light fixtures now. So bringing in warmer tones with kind of an antique brass instead of a satin nickel really warms a space up. And just bringing in more character that way was really important. I switched out all the hardware for, cabinets. And then bringing in color was really important. Like I said, it was a blank space. So thinking about how I wanted to bring in color and pattern as kind of my starting layer.
I love how you've added so much color and pattern. And I think that people might feel in a small space like they can't do that because you're going to see the colors from different rooms and you want it to feel cohesive and it's small, so you want it to feel big. So what are kind of some misconceptions you think people have about small spaces?
I think that especially with more open floor plans that we see nowadays, kind of adding color in different rooms is kind of scary. I think if you pull one color and kind of use it as a thread kind of throughout, especially kind of breaking it into floors. I have 3 floors, but especially like this floor, in my office kind of living room area, I've got a really deep teal kind of bluegrass cloth. And then in my family room, I have really white walls, but I brought in that teal aqua blue color through this couch I'm sitting on. So that was kind of my thread. And you'll see that in the sideboard in my entry and some pottery in my kitchen. So kind of having that thread kind of pulls the whole main floor together.
Your cute slip covers for your stools have that little color too.
My little leopard, yeah. So kind of pulling that through, I think is really important. I wouldn't be afraid to incorporate, color. And I like making distinct spaces.
Yeah.
I think it gives you an opportunity, especially just in a decorating sense with your kind of accessories or artwork, when you kind of have different feels or moods, it kind of sets the tone when you set it inside a room.
Yeah, I love that about your home because I think most people would lean against that in a smaller space.
Sure.
But, your office and front sitting room is moody and in the winter, that's maybe where you'd want to drink a glass of wine. And then in here, it's so light and bright. So that makes sense that you were sort of using the color as the through line in each space.
And kind of leaning into the space and kind of what it calls for, especially with color or even wallpaper. This kind of main pass-through is really open, so I didn't really have the opportunity to use a wallpaper or a different paint color because I don't have a starting stop point.
Yeah.
So kind of letting your rooms kind of lead your choices too. Not trying to force something or kind of box yourself in.
Yeah. You've got a great unit in your complex because you've got windows on 3 sides, which is so nice.
Yes.
But for those people who are in a townhouse or an apartment where they don't have windows on 3 sides, what are some ways that you think people can kind of work with that and make the most of their space?
Most townhouses, especially if you're in a middle unit, they're kind of long and narrow and you have a lot of walls because you are lacking windows. So I think kind of breaking those long walls up into groupings sometimes works better. So, you could do a really big piece of art and then, maybe sliding down the wall, you do a grouping or a grid, or you do plate hanging. So that way you're kind of breaking up those wall spaces and your eye is kind of bouncing around instead of just having 4 big pieces of artwork. It kind of brings interest.
And I've kind of done that here, actually. You've got one big piece, a medium piece, and then the grouping of the plates. Yeah.
I have a lot of openings and windows. So, I love art in as you can tell. So kind of playing up those wall spaces, and I just fill them as much as I can because I don't have a whole lot of it, I think it makes more of an impact. I read somewhere someone was talking about kind of curated collections. I have a lot of things, but I like to group them together. I think it makes more of an impact and it's kind of less clutter. So kind of doing that I think is a good tool.
Yeah, definitely. And I love the way your art is not, you don't just have paintings. Like this is a screen that you've mounted. You've got the tortoise shells. You've got plates and platters. And then you've kind of, what are like some unusual things that people maybe have overlooked that would make a great, focal point on them?
Sure. Well, like you said, the screen behind us, it's super vertical. So it kind of draws your eye up and fills a lot of space without having to pay for a huge commissioned, painting. It's kind of a nice kind of bang for your buck. Plates are really fun. In the entry, I have them kind of centered around a painting. And then, like you said, a collection of tortoise shells is fun and unexpected. People are like, what the heck? I'm like, I know.
How did you mount? I mean, how did you even mount that?
It is a rig, but
don't touch it.
Don't look. Plate hangers for most of them, but just getting creative. And then, in my front office, I have 2 framed pieces of fabric flanking that armoire. So that also is a really good way to fill wall space without just relying on kind of what you typically see, just one big painting.
Yeah. I love the armoire because it too actually is kind of like a piece of art just because it has the beautiful carvings and it looks so great against that grass gloss. Talk to us about that piece.
My armoire. Yeah, so I actually bought that when I was in college. I was perusing an antique mall and I was in a small apartment and didn't have room for it at the time. So I bought it and I called my grandmother and I was like, can I store this in your basement? And she let me. So it's been with me for a long time, but I knew when I saw it that I wanted it and that I would find a spot for it wherever I ended up. So yeah, it's kind of a special piece with a good story and has a lot of uses. Right now it holds my record player. In my old apartment, it held a TV because I couldn't mount a TV on the wall. So kind of a good flex piece.
Yeah, that actually is a great suggestion, I think, because often when you're in a rental space, you maybe want to do stuff to your house, but you can't because of, the security deposit, like you mentioned. Or, just like there's limitations. So what are pieces that you can invest in and know that you're going to have for a long time? I love the armoire as an example because it's a storage solution.
Sure. Well, sometimes you get nervous because you don't want to make large investments when you know something might not be permanent, like you were saying. So I think, everybody needs a couch, right? So maybe you think about, instead of buying that really, oversized sectional that looks really comfy, but it probably won't fit in your next space just because it's really specific. Maybe you pick a standard size sofa and a pair of chairs. And that way those can probably travel with you, whether, you break up the set, maybe you put the 2 chairs in your new bedroom or the sofa goes in a formal living room. But instead of doing like one big, large piece, maybe breaking it up into smaller pieces that have more flexibility.
Are there any other pieces like your armoire that you bought early on, maybe before you bought this place, that you've reimagined in different ways? Things that might give people an idea of what to collect?
I think that buying pieces as you see them is important. You don't necessarily have to have a spot for something when you see it. I think that's what kind of gives you the flexibility is, especially, let's say, lamps. You can use them in so many different ways and places. So maybe they work in your bedroom now on your nightstands. In your next house, you have an opportunity to have 2 end tables and you move them there. So smaller pieces that are flexible, I think is a great option.
Yeah, you're always going to need a pair of lamps.
Yeah.
And a pair looks so great on, nightstands or an entry table on either side of the couch.
Yes.
Like
gives you some flexibility.
I think with a townhouse, we talked about how it's so long and skinny, and I think that's challenging because you mentioned this before. You've got a lot of windows, a lot of doorways, a lot of like pass through. So how did you think about the layout and what sort of issues were you trying to solve for?
Sure. Well, especially in here, symmetry was kind of an issue. This one wall isn't necessarily symmetrical to my fireplace and TV, so I wanted to play up the symmetry where I could. So bringing in those console tables that match, the matching lamps, the matching chairs, chairs. So that kind of gives me kind of a grounding in the space so that my sofa can be off-centered. And then filling in with, your console table and then a floor lamp on the other side kind of gives you the illusion that you have that symmetry. I think especially in longer spaces and in townhouses, you might have to rely a little bit more on chairs for seating. Just because working with a longer linear space, you probably need a longer linear piece of furniture, which is your sofa, but then you don't really have the space to do a pair. You're kind of stuck with one. So just being okay with using chairs, that also gives you the flexibility to move things around, which is nice. So yeah, that's kind of how I kind of solve things in here.
I feel like people are often nervous to float a chair. I love this chair, which is floating. Is there anything that you think about in terms of like the shape of the chairs?
Yeah.
Because you mentioned like having more chairs when you have a long room. Like what are some things you think about?
I think mixing things up is important. So I have a pair of spool chairs in here, which kind of gives you that wood texture. And then bringing in a different textile on the floating chair that you're sitting in. So doing a fun animal print separates the spaces, but makes it cohesive.
Yeah.
I think ottomans, when you can use them, are really convenient. Yeah. I've got a couple in here, especially when you're dealing with a smaller space. If you have a large group of people, kiddos can pile up on the ottoman, and then you can still use them to put your feet up. But that kind of even gives you a couple more seats if you need them.
We touched a little bit on the grass cloth in your sitting room and your office, but you've used grass cloth all over. And I love it because it adds so much pattern. And you mentioned the space being kind of a blank space, a white box when you moved in. So talk us through wallpaper, your favorite ways to use it. How do you pick a wallpaper?
Sure.
All that.
So I love grass cloth just because of the texture that it brings to a room as well as the color. You can always paint a wall, but it just doesn't give you that same kind of feeling and warmth. So I think that's a good way to bring in color is through grass cloth. And then when you want to bring in pattern, you do that in a different wallpaper. So for the main kind of office space, you see it from several angles, and I wanted the flexibility to be able to kind of change things out, move things around. So I did a grass cloth in there just to kind of reduce the pattern. In the powder room, you'll see a really fun leopard wallpaper. And then upstairs, I didn't have any wallpaper on ceilings, which is a forgotten about surface. Putting a wallpaper up on the ceiling was a really fun opportunity.
Yeah.
And then dressing up the bathrooms, because I feel like that's a space where you don't have a whole lot of opportunity to implement a whole lot of character.
Yeah.
You're working around tile. In my case, it was tile that was already put down and I wasn't going to rip it up just because it's a good neutral. But adding character and kind of making it my own through wallpaper, I think is a really, really great way to do.
It adds so much warmth in there.
Totally.
And it's a big bathroom, actually.
Sure.
So you had a lot of wall space. And I imagine when that was white and your tile is light, it's just like there's nothing to break it up. So I love that pattern you picked.
Yeah.
Floral.
I think you want your space to feel like you and it to be a representation of you, and just all neutral just didn't feel like me. So bringing in pattern, whether, I love flowers, I live on the golf course, kind of bringing that outside in, I think is really fun. And not being scared of pattern. I feel like people especially say, well, I'm not going to be here forever. Well, but while you are here, you want it to feel like you.
Yeah.
And so just kind of taking that leap and stepping out of your comfort zone, I think is really fun.
Yeah. I also love the way you brought that little upholstered bench in there, because I think that's something people don't think to do. I haven't thought to do, and it's like a perfect little moment, and it adds so much softness.
Yes.
It's very inviting.
Yeah. Anytime you can bring in upholstery, in bathrooms, even in entryways, I tell people, just adds that level of softness. Those are hard spaces because there's so many hard corners and angles, and there's not an opportunity for a lot of softness. So bringing in fabrics, textiles, and mixing prints is always really fun.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the bedrooms, because you have a strategy in both that I thought was so fun and interesting, and a very designer move that most people don't think about. You've used the same pattern in your guest bedroom on the drapery and the bed skirt, and then in your primary bedroom, you have it on the drapery, a lumbar, and on the ceiling. So talk to us about that. Like, what is fun about it? Why did you do that?
I just think it makes a really large impact. You appreciate the pattern more, first of all. And then when you use it in a different way, it doesn't almost feel like it's the same pattern, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes your eye kind of bounce around the room a lot more. you'll see that I do love mixing patterns, especially kind of in the downstairs area. But that impact, that repeating the same textile that you can get, I think is really special.
Yeah, it looks so polished too. It looks so pulled together.
Mm-hmm.
And really, you've only used it twice. By repeating it, feels more, like polished for some reason.
I think when people especially are doing things on their own, it can feel really overwhelming. I love textiles and I love mixing them, but I do think there's a little bit of an art to that to make it feel, collected yet cohesive. And if you feel overwhelmed and don't know what to do, then just repeat the same textile. Yeah. Do it on your headboard, do it on your bolster, do it on your bed skirt. And you're not taking the easy way out. You're being daring and doing something different, but it take a load off of your shoulders.
Yeah, it's kind of a cheat code.
Yeah.
I get that it could feel scary because you are having to commit to something, but find something you really like. And you have a great little garden space, balcony, I guess, off of your kitchen. Tell us about that because it's so small, but you've outfitted it so nicely and it feels like a whole porch.
Sure. Well, it's kind of an extension of my house, and that was the goal because I don't have a whole lot of spread out space, especially when I'm kind of hosting. So being able to open those doors and have people go in the kitchen and out onto the balcony is fun. But I love a good nap, especially in the summer.
Yeah.
That's kind of my nap spot. So
amazing.
I know. I've got a great sofa and 2 chairs out there. And then I have a little TV so I can watch.
Oh, I didn't even see the TV.
It's hidden. So I can watch, some shows or sports. And it's fun in the summer nights when it's cool being out there. And then I love plants. So having my little space out there to kind of bring some outdoors up.
Yeah,
is fun.
You have such a green thumb. Okay, tell us about all your plants. You've added them throughout. You've got flowers, but then you've got house plants. So
sure,
where do you put a house plant? What's sort of your go-to?
I think that you don't want anything to look like you're walking to the botanical gardens. I think a really pretty, I have a huge fiddly fig tree in my entry. It was not there. That was not the goal, but it just it took off and that's where it will fit.
Yeah.
It adds a little bit of a comfort level that you're not just in a stark cold space, kind of bringing those plants in. And it's a good way to bring in color without bringing in another textile. So I've got my fiddly fig. I've got a lot of ferns on my balcony, some succulents. Think easy when you think plants inside, but I have a lot of natural light and that helps me. It's not I don't know how much of a green thumb it is. It's really just I got lucky with all these windows. Yeah. So they really like it.
But they look great in here. And I love the containers have so much personality.
Yeah. Picking things up as I find them. Maybe try to stay away from a terracotta pot, especially on the inside.
Yeah.
But doing something more of a ceramic. I have a white one with a lot of texture, which is kind of fun and different.
You've got your trays, which I know is probably hard to find, but it helps keep them alive. And it keeps it off your floor.
It's one of those things you don't necessarily want to have as a tray, but they do make clear ones now. So, I can water them in here and those are so big, I can't haul them in and out to water them. So
yeah, you love animal print. You've used it throughout, but I'm curious for someone maybe that wants to try it and is a little nervous. What are some easy things to pair it with?
Well, I like starting with what I call a starter fabric. Crazy name, but it is kind of the foundation usually for a room. And that's where I pull a lot of my color inspiration from. So I think having that starter fabric, in this case, it's kind of the chinoiserie that you see, but it has multiple colors in it. So then you can pull those colors out and bring them in another pattern. So in this case, I used the blue. I did the blush on the window seat. But when you have one fabric that unifies it all, using different patterns feels more cohesive because you're keeping within the right kind of color scheme, if that makes sense.
Totally.
And then, mixing scale of fabrics, I think, is a good way to kind of keep things in mind. So, for instance, say you have a large buffalo check on a chair. Well, mix it with a smaller print pillow. That way you have a balance and those two big prints aren't fighting each other and it'll feel almost like a, more cohesive unit.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, now that you've pointed out that chinoiserie,
yes,
that kind of is your color for the whole house. You've got the green guest bedroom. You have a little bit of blush in your bedroom. You've got the spice, sort of love seat in the office. So you kind of have used that as your base here.
Kind of goes back to that thread we were talking about. Kind of thinking of a color scheme, what do you look good in? What do you like to wear? I think plays a lot into what you surround yourself with as well. So kind of having a starter fabric or a starter painting and using it in one room and then using that thread kind of throughout your house. I think is
that's so smart, and I feel like an easy thing for people to execute. Last thing in here, but I love the way you've layered your rugs.
Yes.
And is this rug something you bought for the space? Is it something you had in a previous and you wanted to make it work? Like, what's the story here?
So I actually had this sisal, I think it was in my old apartment in like a bedroom or something. And so the size just worked in here, but it felt like a lot of brown, and layering it with an older Ushak rug, one kind of softens things, but just kind of adds another layer of texture. I tell people it's less expensive, more bang for your buck to go buy a big sisal rug that really is almost a wall-to-wall than buying a antique Persian rug that's wall-to-wall. So, get that big sisal, and then if you want to bring in a pattern or a color, maybe get a smaller, antique rug to bring in character.
Yeah.
And you're kind of getting the look and feel without, it being such an intimidating purchase.
That makes sense. We talked about things that you could buy early on. Maybe a rug is a good one because maybe it fits your current space if you're somewhere smaller, but then later you could put it under the big sisal and it'll like anchor your grouping.
Yeah. You'd be surprised what you can not make work, but kind of finds a home in another space unintentionally.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Do you do that for clients often? Reimagine things that they already had?
So I do a lot of new construction, but I've also done a lot of renovations or clients moving from one house to another house or moving from one house to their new build. And they'll have pieces, of course, that they've, collected and loved over the years. So yeah, finding a home for things that they love is a big kind of part of that. Where would it work best? And so there's a lot of planning that goes into that.
Are you deciding where something is going to go best just based on like measurements, like where it's going to fit? Or are you picking out, planning a whole room around it?
Sure. Well, scale usually leads a conversation in a room. I think that's one of the biggest errors that people make is scale. We tend to get things that are too small in a room, and it just sticks out like a sore thumb. So yeah, scale kind of leads the conversation. Obviously, if we're talking about rugs, where is this going to work best? And then building off of that rug. So if we know that has a home and maybe they want to start over with their upholstery, maybe we pull colors out of that rug. But size does kind of rule.
Okay, speaking of size, I skipped right over the entryway, and I want to talk about that because we always get questions about double height entryways because there is not a lot of floor space, but there's a lot of volume. And what do you fill that with?
Sure.
But I love what you've done in there. So walk us through that.
Yeah. So to kind of bring in softness, I, brought in an old runner. And then doing a pair of lamps, I think, is really fun. So you don't have to rely on your overhead light all the time. It's kind of fun to turn those down. So I've got a big sideboard so I can bring in some art that way. And then playing with the verticality of the space. Like you said, sometimes it, when you have 2 stories, it almost feels like a waste because you kind of think, what's the point? But bringing in a really large scale piece of art is fun. That's where my fiddly fig ended up. Maybe bringing in, a tree or some plants. I'd add a runner to your stairs. That's another layer of softness you can bring in. And then I have a great light fixture that's kind of the star of the show. So you can usually go bigger than you think in a 2-story foyer. So just think about scale and balancing that out. I think.
How big do you think that light fixture is? Probably like 3 or 4 feet tall.
Yeah. So like a 3x4 is a good starting point. It feels really big, but then think where you're putting it. So
I imagine the box it came in and you're like, this is enormous.
Yeah. And
is it going to fit?
The poor men who hung that thing. I mean, it was.
Don't do that yourself.
Oh, gosh.
I also love the hall tree. And you're right. You have your tree, your hall tree, you've got your fiddly fig tree, and you've got that giant painting. All of those are like filling lots of space up top. And that makes sense.
Storage, I think, in an entry is also really important. I don't have the luxury of a coat closet. I just don't have one on this floor. So having a spot where guests can put their purses and their coats with the bamboo haltery is a good use of space.
Yeah. It's practical.
Sure.
Yeah. So I noticed in your bedrooms, you have all this pattern. You're obviously a big lover of color and pattern, but then your beds are all very crisp and clean and white. So talk to me about that. How do you balance the all white linens with all the pattern throughout?
Like you said, I feel like it's really crisp. It's almost hotel feeling, kind of spa-like. So that kind of plays a part in it. But also from a practicality standpoint, people say, oh, white bedding, but you can bleach white bedding. And I think that's really important, especially when you have a pup that hops up there or you have kids. So that kind of is what pushes me to use that, and especially with a lot of my clients. So I think having, especially with bedding, you're getting in your bed every night. Just a level of simplicity is nice. So doing a white coverlet, a white duvet, maybe it has a fun border or a scalloped edge to elevate it a little bit, but really bringing in your pattern with maybe your custom Euros or your bolster, but keeping those things that, I replace mine every couple of years just due to wear and washing it and probably bleaching it when it says don't bleach it, but I do it anyway. It kind of wears it out. But so just letting your textiles kind of steal the show, and then the white is just kind of a secondary.
That's like your resting spot. I mean, for your eye. But you do have a lot of texture in the bedding. How do you create the all white look, but have it still be layered in terms of what bedding pieces you're
So like
you're
you said, texture is really important. So a coverlet or matelassé usually has a diamond or a scroll print. Something like a really slubby linen is fun, just to kind of, so it doesn't look like a white cotton blanket, just kind of elevates it. The crispness of the king shams and the duvet, like I said, a lot of companies make one with a scalloped edge or a really fun, colorful border. You can even do a monogram. That kind of elevates it. And that crispness against the slubby kind of matelassé kind of gives you that texture and balance.
Okay, so you have the crispness of the duvet at the foot of the bed. You've got the sort of textural matelassé or quilt, and then you have it again.
Yes.
The crisp percale or whatever at the Euro. So that's sort of how you're breaking up. And then you're adding the Euros.
And that's kind of your pattern.
Okay. That makes sense. I would have thought, knowing how much pattern you use throughout the rest of your home, that you would have layered more pattern in the bedding too. So I loved seeing the all white because it was a little unexpected.
Yeah. It just adds that, like I said, kind of more serene vibe. And I think that's important, especially in a bedroom.
Do you ever run into the whites not matching in the bedding, or is that not really a problem?
Not typically. So, you can get an ivory, a cream, a white, but usually like a bright white that's pretty true to the name. And I don't mind just a little bit of difference just because it is layered, but it's not usually an issue.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I love the way you've made them up, and I always find that designers just do the perfect bed, and so I'm always curious how to make the perfect bed. So
well, the perfect bed is perfect because you're here today. It's not always, it doesn't always look like that.
Well, that's all right. It looks great. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you for walking us around and sharing all of your knowledge.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
I'm happy that you're here.
For more house tours like this one, be sure to subscribe to Ballard Designs YouTube channel and follow us on social media.